You don't need a wedding fund, Claire. You'll probably never even get married. My sister Jessica's words hit me like a slap across the face, delivered with such casual cruelty that for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stand there in my father's living room while she looked at me with that expression I'd seen my entire life, the one that said I was somehow less than her, somehow undeserving of the things she took for granted. I'm Claire, 28 years old, and I'd come to Sunday dinner at Dad's house expecting the usual awkward small talk and overcooked pot roast, not this ambush, not my 32-year-old sister demanding that I hand over the $45,000 my mother had saved for my wedding so Jessica could pay her divorce lawyer. Mom had been gone for 18 months now, lost to cancer that had eaten through her body with horrifying speed. And in those final weeks, she'd held my hand and promised me that the wedding fund she'd been saving since I was a little girl would be waiting for me when I found the person I wanted to marry. I'd found that person in Marcus, my fiancé of 3 months, a kind and steady architect who treated me like I mattered, like I was someone worth listening to, worth celebrating, worth loving. We'd been planning a modest backyard wedding, something simple and sweet with maybe 50 guests and a budget of $8,000 because I'd never been the type to need extravagance or attention, never been the golden child who commanded the spotlight the way Jessica always had. But Jessica's marriage to Richard was falling apart after 4 years, crumbling in what she described as a devastating betrayal that required an expensive attorney to make sure she got everything she deserved in the divorce, and somehow in the twisted logic of my family, that meant I should sacrifice the gift my mother had worked overtime shifts and extra holidays to save for me. Dad stood beside Jessica in his living room, his arms crossed over his chest, his face set in that expression of disappointment I knew so well, and he'd already made it clear whose side he was on before I'd even walked through the door. "Jessica needs this now, Claire," he'd said, his voice heavy with implication. "You can wait. You and Marcus can have a small wedding now and do something bigger later when you've saved up." The casual dismissal of my engagement, my plans, my mother's gift, felt like being erased, like being told once again that I was the daughter whose dreams could be postponed, whose feelings could be ignored, whose life could be rearranged to accommodate whatever crisis Jessica had manufactured this week. I worked as a senior data analyst at a tech company in Portland, and just 3 weeks ago I'd received a promotion to analytics director with a salary of $140,000 a year. But my family didn't know that because I'd learned long ago to keep my achievements quiet, to make myself small, to avoid the inevitable comparisons and dismissals that came whenever I succeeded at something. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had been established so long ago that I could barely remember a time when things had been different. Back when we were kids growing up in our modest Portland home, with Mom working double shifts at the hospital and Dad managing a small insurance office downtown. Jessica had been the cheerleader, the popular one with the perfect hair and the endless stream of friends calling the house, the daughter who brought home boyfriends and prom photos and stories that made Dad beam with pride, while I'd been the quiet one with my nose always in a book, the one who spent Friday nights at the library instead of football games, the one who somehow managed to earn a full academic scholarship to a private college while Jessica went to state school for a business degree she barely used. Mom had worked as a nurse for 30 years, picking up extra shifts on holidays and weekends, and I learned only much later that she'd been secretly saving a wedding fund for both of her daughters from her own salary, money Dad didn't even know the full extent of because she'd kept it separate, kept it safe. Jessica got her $45,000 4 years ago for a wedding that had been absolutely lavish, a country club affair with 200 guests, and a designer dress and a honeymoon in Bali, and I remembered standing in the bridal suite helping her into that dress while she complained that Mom hadn't saved more, that she'd had to cut corners on the floral arrangements. I'd been told then that my fund would be waiting when I got engaged, that Mom had been saving for me too, that my turn would come, But Jessica had always gotten priority, had always been first in line for everything from the family car when she turned 16 to the apartment deposit when she moved out to Dad's attention at every family dinner, while my achievements were met with polite nods and quick subject changes. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in mathematics and data science, Dad had said I'd been lucky to have good professors, as if my 4 years of late nights and intensive study had been nothing more than fortunate timing. Mom had been the only one who'd recognized what I'd accomplished, who'd framed my graduation photo and put it on her dresser, who'd told me she was proud of me in a voice that shook with emotion. 3 days before she died, when the hospice bed had been set up in the living room and the morphine made her drift in and out of consciousness, Mom had pressed a sealed envelope into my hands with fingers that trembled from weakness, and she'd made me promise not to open it until I needed it, until the moment came when they tried to take what was mine. "You'll know when," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible over the oxygen machine. "Open it when they try to take what's yours, sweetheart. You'll know." I'd kept that letter in a memory box under my bed for 18 months, unopened, unread, somehow afraid of what it might say or what it might mean, but carrying the weight of it like a talisman, like a promise that Mom had left me something more than just money, something more than just a wedding fund. 2 weeks had passed since that terrible Sunday dinner at Dad's house, and in those 14 days my phone had become a weapon of psychological warfare, buzzing constantly with calls and texts from both Dad and Jessica, each message more desperate and demanding than the last. A relentless campaign designed to wear me down until I gave them what they wanted. Jessica's narrative had crystallized into a tragedy she performed with practiced skill, the story of a devoted wife betrayed by a cheating husband, a woman who needed an expensive lawyer to fight for what was rightfully hers in a divorce she never wanted. And Dad had fully bought into this version of events, or maybe he just found it more convenient than acknowledging any complexity in his golden child situation. "Jessica needs it now, Claire," Dad had said during one particularly heated phone call on Tuesday evening, his voice taking on that tone of parental authority that assumed my compliance. "You can wait for your wedding. You and Marcus are planning something small anyway, just a backyard thing, right? You can use your own money for that, and save the wedding fund for when Jessica's back on her feet and can pay you back." The suggestion that I should fund my own wedding while giving Jessica the money Mom had saved specifically for me felt like being asked to erase myself entirely, to accept that my plans and dreams were somehow less important than whatever crisis Jessica had created this week, and the assumption that Marcus and I were having a backyard thing because we couldn't afford anything better, rather than because we'd chosen something modest stung in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Jessica had been even more direct in her cruelty, her texts peppered with observations clearly designed to make me feel small and undeserving, little jabs wrapped in sisterly concern that left bruises only I could see. "Marcus won't care what kind of wedding you have," she'd written just yesterday. "He's just happy someone said yes to you. He'll understand that family comes first." The implication was clear, that I should be grateful Marcus wanted to marry me at all, that I was lucky to have found someone willing to overlook whatever deficiencies made me less than Jessica, less deserving of celebration or joy or the future I'd been planning. Marcus himself had been supportive, but clearly confused by the dynamics he was witnessing, coming from a family where people generally meant what they said and didn't use love as a bargaining chip. And I could see him struggling to understand how a father could pressure one daughter to sacrifice a deceased mother's gift for another daughter's legal bills. My younger brother Tyler had been almost completely silent through all of this, present at that first Sunday dinner, but saying nothing, watching the confrontation unfold with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned long ago that contradicting Jessica meant becoming the next target, and I couldn't even be angry at him for his silence, because I understood the fear that motivated it, the need to avoid the spotlight of family disapproval. The pressure had intensified with each passing day, building from requests to demands to thinly veiled threats, and Dad had begun deploying his most effective weapon, the one that had controlled my behavior since childhood, his disappointment. "I'm going to be very disappointed if you refuse to help your sister," he'd said during our last conversation, the words heavy with meaning, with the promise of withdrawal and coldness, and the particular punishment of being shut out from the family I'd spent my whole life trying to belong to. I lay awake at night beside Marcus, feeling the weight of that guilt, the sense that maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I should just give Jessica the money and have the small wedding we'd originally planned. Maybe keeping peace with my family was worth more than the wedding Mom had wanted me to have. But then I'd remember Mom's face in those final weeks, the way she'd pressed that letter into my hands and made me promise to open it when they tried to take what was mine. And I'd know that this moment was exactly what she'd been preparing me for. The memories of Mom's final weeks had taken on a crystalline quality in my mind, each moment preserved with the sharp clarity that comes from knowing you're living through something you'll need to remember forever. And I found myself returning to those conversations now as the pressure from Dad and Jessica mounted, seeking guidance from a woman who could no longer speak, but who had somehow known exactly what I would face. The hospice bed had been set up in our living room because Mom wanted to be part of the household until the very end, didn't want to be isolated in a back bedroom where life happened without her. And I'd taken family leave from work to be there during those final 3 weeks, sitting beside her for hours while Dad was at the office, and Jessica made brief, uncomfortable visits that never lasted more than 20 minutes. During one of our quiet afternoons together, when the autumn light slanted through the curtains and the morphine hadn't yet pulled her too far away, Mom had reached for my hand with fingers that felt like bird bones wrapped in paper-thin skin and said, "I see you, Claire. I've always seen you." And the way she said it made me understand that she was apologizing for something, acknowledging a truth we'd both lived with but never named directly. She told me then about the wedding fund, speaking slowly between labored breaths, explaining that she'd saved it entirely from her own nursing salary over 15 years, that Dad didn't know the full amount because she'd kept it in a separate account, that she'd been protecting this money specifically for me because she knew what would happen if the family had access to it. "Keep it in your name only," she'd insisted, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. "Don't tell them how much it is. Don't give them access. This is from me to you, Claire. My salary, my choice, my gift to my daughter." 3 days before she died, when the lucid moments had become rare and precious, she'd pressed that sealed envelope into my hands and made me promise not to open it until I needed it, until the moment came when they tried to take what was mine, and her exact words had been, "Open it when they try to take what's yours. You'll know when." I'd promised to use the money for a wedding she would have loved, and she'd smiled at that. A real smile that briefly transformed her gaunt face back into something recognizable as the mother I'd always known. "Invite only people who truly value you," she'd whispered. "Not obligation, not guilt, only love." I understood now, sitting in my apartment 2 weeks into Jessica's campaign of pressure and manipulation, that Mom had protected this fund precisely because she'd known this moment would come, had predicted with perfect accuracy that Jessica would create some crisis that Dad would enable, and I would be expected to sacrifice myself to solve. And the recognition that my mother had understood the family dynamics so completely and had taken concrete steps to protect me from them filled me with a grief so profound it was almost physical. Jessica showed up at my apartment unannounced on Thursday evening, 3 days after that last phone call with Dad, and I knew the moment I saw her through the peephole that this confrontation was going to be different from the phone calls and texts, more visceral and immediate and harder to escape, her face already contorted with an expression that mingled tears with anger in a performance I'd seen her deploy countless times throughout our lives whenever she needed something from someone who was reluctant to give it. I made the mistake of opening the door, some deeply ingrained sense of family obligation overriding my better judgment, and Jessica pushed past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. her designer handbag hitting the coffee table with an expensive thud as she collapsed onto my couch like a woman who'd been pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. "I need you to understand what's happening to me," she began. And then the tears came in earnest, or at least what looked like earnest. Mascara tracking down her carefully made-up face as she launched into a detailed account of Richard's supposed abuse, emotional manipulation and gaslighting, and controlling behavior that I would later learn was entirely fabricated or at least dramatically exaggerated, a narrative constructed specifically to justify what she was about to ask me for. "Mom would want family to help family," Jessica said, invoking our mother's memory with a casual confidence that made my chest tighten with anger because she was using the woman who'd seen through her manipulations, who'd protected me from exactly this moment, as a weapon against me. Then came the real reason for the visit, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone explaining something obvious that I'd been too stupid to grasp through phone calls alone. She'd already hired the lawyer, had already promised a $20,000 retainer, needed the money immediately, or she would lose everything in the divorce. And the way she said it made clear that my cooperation wasn't really a request, but an expectation, an assumption that, of course, I would sacrifice my wedding fund because her crisis was real and immediate, while my wedding was just a party that could wait, or be scaled back, or paid for some other way. I found myself noticing details about Jessica that undermined her performance of desperate poverty. The luxury apartment she was sitting in with its view of downtown Portland, the designer clothes that probably cost more than my entire monthly wardrobe budget, the new Mercedes I'd seen parked in the visitor spot outside with temporary tags still in the window, and when I gently suggested that maybe she could sell some things or downsize or find some other way to fund her legal bills, her face transformed from tearful desperation to pure outrage. "I shouldn't have to sacrifice my life because of what Richard did to me," she snapped, the tears drying up with remarkable speed. And then she deployed the accusation I'd been half expecting since this whole nightmare began. "You were always Mom's favorite anyway. You got all her attention. She practically worshipped you while the rest of us had to fight for scraps." The gaslighting attempt was so audacious, such a complete rewriting of our actual childhood, where Jessica had been the sun around which our family orbited, while I'd been the dim star barely visible in her glare, that I actually laughed. A short, bitter sound that seemed to enrage her further, and we might have escalated into a full screaming match, except that Marcus came home at that exact moment, walking into a scene of his fiancée standing rigid with anger, while her sister sat on their couch, radiating hostility and entitlement. Marcus took in the situation with the quick assessment of someone who'd heard enough stories to understand the dynamics, and he said calmly but firmly, "Jessica, I think you need to leave now." And when she opened her mouth to protest or continue her manipulation, he simply repeated, "You need to leave," in a tone that made clear this wasn't negotiable. Jessica stood up, grabbed her expensive bag, and delivered her parting shot with venomous precision. "Fine, but Dad will hear about this. How you turned your back on your sister when she needed you most. How your fiancé threw me out of your apartment. All of it." And then she was gone, the door slamming behind her hard enough to rattle the frame. I stood there shaking, adrenaline flooding my system with the aftermath of confrontation, and Marcus wrapped his arms around me while I trembled against his chest. And in that moment of being held by someone who actually saw my worth and protected my boundaries, I made the decision I should have made days ago, that I was finally ready to open Mom's letter and read whatever wisdom she'd left me for exactly this situation. I sat at our small kitchen table that evening after Marcus asked Jessica to leave, the sealed envelope trembling slightly in my hands, because even though Mom had been gone for 18 months, this was still her handwriting on the paper, still her words waiting inside. And Marcus settled into the chair beside me, without saying anything because he understood that this moment needed to happen, and that I needed him there, but didn't need him to fill the silence with reassurances or questions. The envelope was cream-colored and had aged slightly in the memory box where I'd kept it tucked between photos and Mom's favorite bookmark and a handful of other small treasures. And when I finally worked my finger under the seal and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside, I recognized immediately the slight shakiness in Mom's usually neat handwriting, evidence that she'd written this during those final days when even holding a pen had become difficult. The letter was dated 1 week before her death, during that narrow window when she'd still been lucid enough to write, but sick enough to know exactly how little time remained, and it began with words that made my throat tighten. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, they're trying to take it from you. Mom had known with perfect clarity what would happen after she was gone, had predicted that Jessica would create some crisis, and Dad would enable it, and I would be pressured to sacrifice the wedding fund. And reading her acknowledgement of this pattern made me feel simultaneously validated and heartbroken, because it meant she'd understood the family dynamics completely, but hadn't been able to change them, had only been able to protect me from a distance. Then came the confession that made me gasp audibly enough that Marcus leaned closer to read over my shoulder. The wedding fund wasn't $45,000 like Jessica's had been, wasn't the amount I'd been carefully budgeting around for months, as I'd planned a modest ceremony that would preserve most of it for our future. Mom had kept a separate bank account that Dad had never known about, had saved for years beyond what she'd saved for Jessica's wedding, and my fund actually contained $85,000, nearly double what my sister had received, and far more than I'd ever imagined Mom could have set aside from her nursing salary. I saved the extra years as an apology, Mom had written in that shaky script, for all the times I didn't stand up for you the way I should have, for every achievement that got dismissed, for every moment you stood in Jessica's shadow while I stayed quiet to keep peace in the house. The letter included specific details about the second account at a different bank, an account number and passwords, and the name of Mom's friend Susan who worked there and knew to expect me. And then came the instruction that felt like Mom reaching across the barrier of death to put her hands on my shoulders and look me directly in the eyes. Don't give them a penny, Claire. This is my gift to my daughter, from my salary and my sacrifice and my love for you. Use it to build the life you deserve, free from their interference and their demands and their casual cruelty. Mom's final words blurred as tears filled my eyes. You are worth so much more than they see, sweetheart. You always have been. Build the life you deserve, marry that good man who loves you properly, and don't let them make you small ever again. Marcus's hand found mine on the table, his fingers warm and steady, and he said quietly, "Your mom really knew them, didn't she?" And I nodded because speech felt impossible in that moment, overwhelmed by the recognition that my mother had loved me enough to spend years protecting me from my own family, had understood that the greatest gift she could give me wasn't just money, but permission to value myself, to refuse their demands, to choose my own worth over their expectations. The decision that had been wavering under the weight of guilt and family obligation suddenly solidified into something unshakable. I would not give Jessica a single dollar of the money Mom had saved specifically to set me free. I called Dad the next morning, Friday, after a night where sleep had come in restless fragments between long stretches of staring at the ceiling and thinking about Mom's letter, and the $85,000 she'd saved specifically to set me free from exactly this kind of family manipulation. And when he answered on the second ring with a cautious, "Claire?" I could hear in his voice that he already knew this conversation wasn't going to go the way he wanted. "I'm calling to tell you that I won't be giving Jessica the wedding fund," I said, keeping my voice as calm and steady as I could manage despite the adrenaline making my hands shake, and there was a beat of silence before Dad's anger came through the phone like a physical force. "Your mother would be ashamed of you," he said, deploying the weapon he must have thought would devastate me, using Mom's memory against me the same way Jessica had tried to do. But this time I had armor in the form of Mom's own words written in her shaky handwriting, telling me to refuse them. "Actually, Mom left me a letter," I said, and I heard Dad's breathing change on the other end of the line. "She predicted this exact situation, predicted that you and Jessica would pressure me to give up the wedding fund, and she specifically instructed me not to give anyone a single penny, because this was her gift to me from her own salary that she saved for years. The silence that followed felt heavy with Dad's shock, and when he finally spoke, his voice had shifted from righteous anger to something more uncertain. "What letter? Your mother never said anything about a letter." I didn't owe him an explanation about when or how Mom had given it to me. Didn't need to justify the private relationship I'd had with her during those final weeks, so I simply said, "The money was specifically designated for my wedding, from Mom to me, and I'm going to use it exactly as she intended." Dad recovered quickly, pivoting to a different argument. "Jessica needs it more than you need a party, Claire. She's losing everything in this divorce, and you're just being selfish." The word selfish stung the way it always had, that particular accusation carrying decades of conditioning to put myself last and accept whatever scraps of attention or resources remained after Jessica had taken her fill. But I thought about Mom's letter and Marcus's arms around me, and the wedding I was finally going to plan without guilt, and I found strength I didn't know I possessed. "Then Jessica should have planned better, or you should help her with your own money," I said, and Dad made a scoffing sound. "I'm not dipping into my retirement fund for her mistakes," he said, and the hypocrisy was so blatant that I actually laughed. "But I should give up Mom's gift for her mistakes?" I asked. "How is that fair, Dad? How is it okay for you to protect your retirement, but I'm supposed to sacrifice my wedding fund?" He had no answer to that, no logical response that wouldn't expose the fundamental unfairness of what he was demanding, and after a few seconds of silence, he simply hung up on me, the click of disconnection feeling both like an ending and a beginning. Jessica called less than 2 minutes later, and I knew Dad had immediately contacted her to report that I was refusing, and when I answered, I was greeted with screaming, her voice shrill with rage as she accused me of being spiteful and jealous and selfish, told me I had never cared about this family, and that I was a terrible sister and a terrible daughter, and Mom would be disgusted by my selfishness. "You never cared about this family," Jessica spat. And something in me finally broke free from the last threads of obligation. "I'm not discussing this anymore," I said, cutting through her tirade. "The answer is no. It's going to stay no, and I need you to stop contacting me about this." I hung up before she could respond, and then I did something I should have done years ago. I blocked both their numbers, at least temporarily, cutting off their access to me and the constant pressure and manipulation. My phone buzzed a minute later with a text from Tyler. "I don't blame you, they're being crazy." It was the first time in our lives that Tyler had openly supported me over Jessica, the first time he'd broken ranks with the family narrative, and that small validation felt more significant than it probably should have, like I wasn't completely alone in seeing the insanity of what was being demanded of me. Marcus came home from his morning run to find me sitting on the couch staring at my phone, and when I told him what had happened, he pulled me close and said, "I'm proud of you." And then we opened his laptop and started seriously planning the wedding with the full budget Mom had left me, designing the celebration she'd dreamed of giving me for over a decade. What my family had never known during all those years of dismissing my achievements and comparing me unfavorably to Jessica was that I'd quietly built a career that had far surpassed anything my sister had accomplished. And as I sat at my desk the Monday after blocking both Dad and Jessica's numbers, responding to emails and reviewing data analytics reports, I found myself thinking about how carefully I'd learned to hide my professional success from people who would only diminish it. I was a senior data analyst at Tech Vision Solutions, a mid-sized technology company in downtown Portland, and 3 weeks earlier, I'd received a promotion to analytics director with a salary of $140,000 a year, nearly triple what I'd been making when I'd first joined the company 5 years ago, fresh out of graduate school with my master's in data science. The promotion had come with congratulations from my CEO, a corner office with windows overlooking the river, and management of a team of 12 analysts. But I hadn't mentioned any of it at Dad's house during those Sunday dinners, where Jessica dominated conversation with stories about her real estate sales, and I certainly hadn't brought it up during the escalating conflict over the wedding fund, because I'd learned long ago that sharing my achievements with my family only resulted in them being minimized or dismissed entirely. Jessica worked in residential real estate sales with wildly inconsistent income. One month bragging about a commission check from a luxury property sale, and the next complaining about slow markets and difficult clients. But she always presented herself as wildly successful, even though she was perpetually broke and asking Dad for money to cover her expensive lifestyle. Meanwhile, I'd been living modestly in my one-bedroom apartment with Marcus, driving my paid-off Honda Civic, cooking dinners at home instead of eating out constantly, and systematically saving money until I'd accumulated $95,000 in my personal savings account, completely separate from Mom's wedding fund. And Marcus and I had been planning to use those savings as a down payment on a house after the wedding. My coworker Amanda, who'd become a close friend over the past 2 years, knew the basic outline of my family situation because she'd witnessed enough awkward phone calls and seen me upset enough times after family gatherings, and she'd asked me more than once why I even maintained contact with people who treated me so poorly. "Why do you even talk to them?" she'd said just last week when I'd mentioned the wedding fund pressure, and I hadn't had a good answer beyond loyalty and guilt and the complicated obligation that comes with family ties, even when those ties feel more like chains. I remembered my college graduation 6 years ago, when Mom had been the only family member in attendance because Dad and Jessica had been too busy with Jessica's real estate licensing exam. Never mind that my graduation was from a prestigious private college where I'd earned my bachelor's degree summa cum laude with a double major in mathematics and computer science on a full academic scholarship. I'd received a job offer 2 days after graduation from a consulting firm in Seattle, with a starting salary of $65,000. And when I'd mentioned it excitedly during a phone call home, Jessica had dismissed it with, "Anyone can work with computers, Claire. I work with people," as if technical expertise was somehow less valuable than her ability to schmooze potential home buyers. That pattern had repeated itself over and over through the years. Every promotion downplayed, every achievement minimized, until I'd simply stopped sharing anything significant with Dad or Jessica, saving my celebrations for Mom during our private phone calls, and now for Marcus, who understood exactly how hard I'd worked and how much I'd accomplished. Mom had been the only family member at my graduate school graduation too, sitting in the audience beaming with pride while I received my master's degree and the department's outstanding thesis award. And now Mom's letter was making more sense each day as I recognized how clearly she'd understood that my father and sister had never valued my contributions to anything, had never seen me as anything more than the quiet middle daughter whose role was to fade into the background while Jessica shined in the spotlight they'd constructed for her. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of clear spring light that made everything feel possible, and Marcus and I drove to our appointment with Elena Martinez, the wedding planner whose portfolio I'd been studying for weeks after Susan had recommended her, saying Mom had actually looked at Elena's work years ago and loved her elegant but personal style. We met at Elena's office in a renovated brick building in Portland's Pearl District, and I felt my heart racing as we sat down at her conference table with inspiration boards and vendor portfolios spread before us, because this was real. This was actually happening. And I had the full $85,000 Mom had left me, though Marcus and I had agreed to use about $35,000 for the wedding itself and save the rest as Mom had intended. Elena listened as I described what I wanted, and I found myself talking about the waterfront venue I'd seen online, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Columbia River and gardens that would be perfect for photos, and she nodded and smiled and said she knew exactly the place I meant, and she could definitely get us in for an October date. We talked about flowers, and I heard myself saying I wanted peonies and garden roses, the flowers Mom had always loved, the ones she'd grown in her garden every summer and brought inside in big bouquets that made the whole house smell like happiness. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand as I described the menu I envisioned, including Mom's favorite dishes, the herb-crusted salmon she'd always ordered for special occasions, and the lemon cake with raspberry filling she'd made for every birthday. And Elena made notes and asked questions and treated every detail like it mattered, like my vision was valid and beautiful. I told her about wanting a memorial table for Mom with photos from throughout her life, and Elena's eyes got soft, and she said that would be lovely, that honoring the people who couldn't be there was one of the most meaningful things we could do. And I realized this was the first time since Mom's funeral that someone besides Marcus had acknowledged my grief without trying to rush past it or minimize it. Marcus watched me come alive during that planning session, watched me express opinions and preferences I'd kept suppressed for so long. And later, he told me it was like seeing me step fully into myself for the first time. Elena commented on how clear my vision was, how I knew exactly what I wanted. And I realized with a start that she was right, that I had always known what I wanted, but had learned to suppress it, to make myself small, to not ask for too much or want too much, or take up too much space in a family where Jessica's desires always came first. We booked the waterfront venue for October 15th, 6 months away, and I wrote the deposit check with hands that only shook a little. And when Elena handed me the contract to sign, I felt a surge of rightness, of commitment, of stepping into the future Mom had wanted me to have. That evening, I posted a single engagement photo on social media, something I rarely did because I'd never been comfortable with public sharing, but this felt important, felt like claiming my happiness publicly. The congratulations started coming immediately from coworkers and friends, warm messages from people who knew me and genuinely cared. And there was nothing from Dad or Jessica because they were still blocked. But Tyler commented, "So happy for you, sis," with 3 heart emojis. And then Susan, Mom's best friend, and the banker who'd helped Mom set up my secret account, reached out with a message that made me cry. "Your mom would be thrilled, Claire. She talked about your wedding all the time, showed me magazine clippings of ideas she loved for you. She'd been planning this gift for over 10 years. Susan offered to help with any planning I needed. And as we messaged back and forth, I learned that Mom had been collecting wedding inspiration for me since I was in high school, that she'd had a whole folder of ideas and dreams for the day her middle daughter would finally be celebrated the way she deserved. And I was overwhelmed by the evidence of Mom's love and foresight, by the realization that even when I'd felt invisible and overlooked, Mom had been seeing me and planning for my future and building me a foundation of protection and possibility that extended far beyond the money she'd saved. A week after booking the venue, when the reality of my wedding had started to feel tangible and wonderful rather than anxiety-inducing, Tyler called me on Tuesday morning and asked if we could meet for coffee. And something in his voice told me this wasn't just a casual check-in, but something more serious, something I needed to hear. We met at a small cafe near my office, one of those independent places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, and Tyler looked uncomfortable as he stirred sugar into his coffee without meeting my eyes. And finally he said, "I need to tell you the truth about Jessica's divorce. The real truth. Because Dad and Jessica have been lying to everyone, and I can't watch them try to manipulate you anymore." What Tyler revealed over the next 20 minutes made my anger and my sense of validation rise in equal measure, because the divorce wasn't about Richard cheating at all. Richard hadn't cheated on anyone. But Jessica had been having an affair for over a year with a married man she'd met through her real estate work, and when Richard had discovered evidence of the affair 6 months ago, he'd been the one to file for divorce, not Jessica. Jessica wanted an aggressive lawyer not to protect herself from an abusive, cheating husband, but to hide assets she'd been secretly accumulating and to maximize what she could take from Richard in the settlement. And she'd been hiding money in separate accounts, had maxed out their joint credit cards on personal purchases she'd kept secret, had been systematically deceiving her husband financially as well as emotionally, and Richard had evidence of all of it. Text messages and bank statements and credit card bills that painted a clear picture of Jessica's betrayal and deception. Tyler told me that Jessica's expensive lawyer wasn't for protection, it was for offense. An attempt to paint herself as the victim and Richard as the villain despite all evidence to the contrary. And Tyler had been increasingly uncomfortable with being pressured to lie for Jessica, to tell people that Richard was the cheater, to maintain a narrative that Tyler knew was completely false. "Dad knows the truth," Tyler said quietly, looking miserable. "He's known from the beginning. But he maintains Jessica's victim story anyway, because that's what he's always done, protected Jessica's image no matter what the reality is." Tyler's hands shook slightly as he continued. "They expected you to fund the consequences of her affair, Claire. They wanted you to give up Mom's gift so Jessica could pay a lawyer to help her lie and cheat her way through a divorce that's entirely her own fault." I felt anger surge through me, hot and clarifying, but also a strange sense of validation, because this explained so much about Jessica's desperation and Dad's aggressive pressure. And Tyler was apologizing now, saying he should have told me sooner, that he'd been afraid of becoming the target the way I'd always been the target, afraid of losing what little family connection he'd had. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand and told him I understood. That fear of becoming the scapegoat was powerful and real, and I thanked him for finding the courage to tell me the truth now, when it mattered, when I needed to know that my decision to refuse had been the right one. "Mom always said you were the strong one," Tyler told me, and his eyes were wet. "She told me once, maybe 6 months before she died, that I should watch out for you after she was gone. Not because you couldn't take care of yourself, but because you'd need someone in the family to see you the way she did, to be on your side when Dad and Jessica inevitably tried to take advantage of your kindness." I hadn't known about that conversation, hadn't known that Mom had been preparing Tyler too, building me a network of protection that extended beyond money and letters, and Tyler promised me that he'd stay in touch regardless of whatever family drama resulted from his honesty, that he was done choosing Jessica's lies over the truth, done being complicit in the way our family had always treated me as less important, less valuable, less worthy of consideration. As we left the cafe and hugged goodbye on the sidewalk, I felt less alone than I had in months, felt the solid presence of an ally who'd finally found his own courage, and I realized that Jessica's desperation made complete sense now, that she could lose everything in the divorce, not because of Richard's cruelty, but because of her own choices, her own deceptions, her own betrayals, and my resolve strengthened into something unshakable. I would definitely never give her a single dollar of the money Mom had protected for me. Dad showed up at my workplace on Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after my coffee meeting with Tyler, and when the receptionist called my extension to tell me my father was in the lobby asking to see me, I felt my stomach drop, but I also felt something else. Something harder and clearer than the old fear and guilt, and I told her I'd be right down. I found him standing near the windows overlooking the city, and he looked tired and angry, his face lined with stress I'd never noticed before, and his first words when he saw me were, "We need to talk about your selfishness." And I felt the old instinct to apologize, to make myself smaller, to fix whatever was making him angry, but instead I heard myself say calmly, "We can talk here for 5 minutes." And I didn't move toward the conference rooms or suggest somewhere more private, just stood there in the lobby where my coworkers passed by and the receptionist could hear everything. Dad demanded I reconsider helping Jessica, that family helps family in crisis, that I was being cruel and unreasonable, and I said quietly, "Jessica created her own crisis." And I watched his face redden as he snapped, "Who told you that? Tyler? He's exaggerating. He doesn't understand the complexity of adult relationships." And I asked, "So she didn't have an affair?" And Dad was caught off guard, clearly hadn't expected me to know the truth, and he deflected with, "That's not the point, Claire. She's still your sister, she's still family, and she needs help." And I replied, "And this is still my wedding fund from Mom, money she saved specifically for me, money she told me not to give away." Dad's expression shifted then, became harder, more desperate, and he played what he clearly thought was his final card, the ultimate threat he believed would bring me back in line. "Then you need to choose, Claire. Choose to help Jessica, or be cut off from this family. If you don't help her, you're not welcome at family events, holidays, any of it." and I felt grief wash through me. Genuine sadness for the father-daughter relationship I'd never actually had, but had kept hoping might somehow materialize. And in that moment of grief came clarity, sharp and liberating, and I said, then I guess I'm not welcome, and I'm okay with that. Dad clearly hadn't expected this response, had been so certain his ultimatum would work, that the threat of losing family would terrify me into compliance the way it always had. And he sputtered, "You'll regret this, Claire. You'll end up alone, bitter, with no family, no one who really knows you." And I felt tears prick my eyes, but my voice stayed steady as I said, I have Marcus, I have Tyler, I have friends, I have people who actually value me, who see me, who don't treat me like I'm worth less than Jessica just because I'm quieter or different. And Dad's face twisted with anger and he spat out, "Fine, then you're not invited to Christmas, Thanksgiving, any family gatherings, you've made your choice." And I said simply, "Okay, is that all?" And the dismissal in my tone, the calm acceptance, seemed to infuriate him more than argument would have. And he turned and stormed out of the lobby while several people stood watching, and I remained standing there, shaking, but also feeling strangely empowered, feeling like I'd finally stopped performing the exhausting dance of trying to earn love from people who'd never intended to give it. I went back upstairs to my office and Amanda saw my face and came over immediately, and I told her, I just got disowned for not funding my sister's divorce lawyer. And Amanda hugged me hard and said, their loss, you're amazing, and honestly, they never deserved you. And I cried at my desk for a few minutes, then composed myself and sent an email to Tyler explaining what had happened, and Tyler responded within minutes. I'll still see you. This is insane. I'm sorry Dad is like this. And I blocked Dad's number permanently in my phone, adding him to the same blocked list where Jessica already resided. And as I sat there in my office looking out at the Portland skyline, I felt sad. But I also felt something unexpected, something light and free. Like I'd been carrying a weight for so long, I'd forgotten it was there until suddenly it was gone. That evening when I got home from work, drained from the confrontation with Dad and the emotional aftermath, I found Marcus in our kitchen cooking my favorite dinner, homemade lasagna with garlic bread, and the smell alone made me want to cry again because it was such a simple gesture of care, of knowing what I needed without me having to ask. We ate mostly in silence at first, both of us processing the enormity of what had happened, the finality of Dad's ultimatum, and my acceptance of it. And afterward we sat on the couch with tea and Marcus took my hand and said, I need to say something, Claire. Something I've been holding back. And I felt a flash of fear, worried that he was overwhelmed by my family drama, that he was having second thoughts about marrying into this mess. But Marcus squeezed my hand and said, your family treats you like you're nothing. Like you're someone to be tolerated rather than celebrated. And I need you to know that to me, to everyone who actually knows you, you're everything. He listed things then, specific things he valued about me, my intelligence and the way I could see patterns in data that other people missed, my kindness even to people who didn't deserve it, my quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself, the way I'd built a successful career through hard work and talent without ever bragging or diminishing anyone else to elevate myself, my thoughtfulness, and the way I remembered tiny details about people's lives and preferences. And as he talked, I felt tears streaming down my face, because no one except Mom had ever articulated my worth this way, had ever really seen me clearly enough to name these things. When you stood up to your dad today, Marcus continued, his voice thick with emotion, when you chose yourself and chose us, and chose to honor your mom's gift instead of caving to their pressure, I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life. And he admitted then that he'd been worried I would eventually cave to the family pressure, not because of the money, but because of the pattern he'd watched over the past year we'd been engaged, the pattern of me putting myself last, minimizing my own needs, trying to earn love from people who'd never intended to give it. I want to marry someone who knows her worth, Marcus said. And today you showed me that you do, That you finally see yourself the way I see you, the way your mom saw you." And then he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, not the ring box from our engagement, but something new. And inside was the most beautiful ring I'd ever seen. Vintage style with sapphires surrounded by small diamonds, exactly the style I'd shown him once in a magazine months ago, and then forgotten about. "I've been saving," he said softly, "because I wanted you to have what you deserve. I wanted you to have something as beautiful as you are. And I was waiting for the right moment. And somehow today feels like that moment, the day you finally chose yourself." I was crying too hard to speak, could only nod as he slipped the new ring onto my finger alongside the modest original engagement ring, and I finally managed to say, "You see me? You really see me." And Marcus pulled me close and whispered, "The way your mom saw you, Claire." "I promise I always will." And in that moment, I understood what partnership was supposed to feel like, what love looked like when it was real and unconditional. And the contrast with my family relationships was so stark it almost hurt. We talked for hours that night about our future, about limiting contact with my family to whatever felt healthy and safe, about building our own traditions for holidays rather than fighting for inclusion in celebrations where I wasn't wanted. And Marcus suggested we could elope if the family drama was making the wedding too stressful, but I shook my head firmly and said, "No, I want the wedding. Mom wanted me to have this wedding, and I'm going to have the most beautiful day celebrating with people who actually love me, who actually see my worth." And that decision felt powerful and right, felt like another choice to honor myself and Mom's gift, rather than shrinking to accommodate people who would never be satisfied anyway. And as Marcus and I sat there planning our future and our family of choice, I felt more certain than I ever had that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, with exactly the right person, building exactly the life Mom had hoped I would have. 3 months passed like a slow exhale, the kind where you don't realize you've been holding your breath until suddenly your lungs fill with air again, and by May the wedding planning was in full swing with our October date approaching steadily, and during those months I felt myself transforming in small but significant ways, becoming more solid in my sense of self, more certain of my worth, independent of my family's validation. My promotion to analytics director was publicly announced at work in early May, complete with a LinkedIn post from our CEO and a feature in the company newsletter. And within hours, I had dozens of comments and messages from coworkers and professional contacts congratulating me, celebrating this achievement that my family had never even known to dismiss. And I felt proud in a way I'd trained myself not to feel growing up. Allowed myself to post about it on my personal social media with a simple statement about being grateful for the opportunity. 2 days after the announcement, I received a message request on Instagram from an account I didn't recognize, and when I opened it, I saw it was Jessica, who had somehow found a way to contact me despite being blocked. Probably through a mutual friends account or a fake profile she'd created specifically for this purpose, and the message said, "Congratulations on your promotion, Claire. Must be nice to have everything work out so perfectly for you." And the passive-aggressive tone was so familiar, the implication so clear that I didn't deserve this success, that it had simply fallen into my lap through luck rather than effort. And I didn't respond, just took a screenshot from my records and deleted the message, refusing to let her poison this achievement. Tyler had become a regular fixture in my and Marcus's life during those 3 months, joining us for dinner every week, and he'd met Marcus's parents and sister and told me quietly one evening that he felt more welcomed and seen by them in a few dinners than he'd ever felt at our own family gatherings. And when I asked how Dad and Jessica were treating him for maintaining contact with me, Tyler shrugged and said, "They're barely speaking to me, making comments about loyalty and how I'm choosing sides. But honestly, Claire, it's worth it. I should have stood up years ago instead of being a coward." And I assured him he wasn't a coward, that survival sometimes meant staying silent, but I was grateful he'd found his voice now. My circle of friends expanded during those months in ways I hadn't expected. Coworkers I'd kept at professional distance became real friends, and Marcus's college friends embraced me completely. And I realized I'd been so focused on trying to earn love from people who would never give it that I'd missed opportunities for connection with people who actually valued me. Susan, Mom's best friend, and the banker who'd helped Mom set up my secret wedding fund, became something like a surrogate mother during this time, meeting me for coffee every few weeks, helping with wedding planning decisions, sharing stories about Mom that I'd never heard, and one afternoon in late April, Susan revealed something that shifted my understanding of everything. Mom had known about her terminal diagnosis 6 months before she'd told the family, had spent that time quietly preparing me for a life of independence, setting up not just the wedding fund, but also making sure I had connections and resources, and the knowledge that I was loved. The wedding fund was just one part of her plan, Susan told me gently, stirring her coffee, and then she pulled out a sealed envelope from her purse, my name written on it in Mom's handwriting, and explained that Mom had written several letters before she'd gotten too sick, including one addressed to Marcus that she'd asked Susan to give me when the time felt right. I brought the letter home that evening with shaking hands and gave it to Marcus, telling him Mom had written to him before she died, and Marcus took it into our bedroom to read privately. And when he came out 20 minutes later, his eyes were red, and he pulled me into his arms and said, "Your mom was an incredible woman, Claire. She wrote to thank me for seeing your worth, for loving you the way you deserve, and she asked me to protect you from your family if they ever tried to diminish you, and she gave us her blessing, told me she knew I would make you happy." And I cried against his chest, overwhelmed by the depth of Mom's love and foresight, by the realization that even in her final weeks she'd been thinking of my future and happiness, and I felt grateful rather than sad, grateful that I'd had her at all, that she'd seen me clearly enough to prepare me for exactly this situation. The bridal shower took place on a warm Saturday afternoon in June at Marcus's sister Rachel's house, a beautiful craftsman with a sprawling backyard garden that she'd opened up for the occasion. And as I walked through the gate and saw the white streamers and flowers and the tables set up with delicate china and champagne glasses, I felt a surge of emotion because Rachel and my coworker Amanda had planned all of this for me, had invited 30 people who actually wanted to celebrate my happiness, and the guest list included my coworkers from the analytics team, friends Marcus and I had made as a couple, Marcus's entire family who had embraced me completely, and Tyler with his girlfriend Mia, who he'd met through us at a dinner party 2 months earlier, and who had become a genuine friend in her own right. There was a moment when I first arrived where I felt the absence of my own family, like a physical hollow in my chest. The recognition that aside from Tyler and Mia, no one from my side was here, no aunts or cousins or childhood friends, because Jessica had always dominated those relationships, and they'd faded after I'd stopped trying to compete for space in her shadow. But then Rachel hugged me and pulled me into the garden, where everyone started cheering, and I felt the hollow fill with something warmer. Gratitude for the people who were present, rather than grief for the ones who weren't. The afternoon unfolded with games and gifts and laughter, the kind of genuine celebration I'd trained myself not to expect. And when Susan arrived carrying a small velvet box, I knew before she even opened it what it contained, and she confirmed it by saying, "Your mom wanted you to wear this on your wedding day, Claire. She made me promise I'd give it to you at the right moment." And inside was Mom's pearl necklace, the one she'd worn in her own wedding photos, the one I'd loved as a child. And I started crying as Susan fastened it around my neck, and suddenly everyone was crying too. And Rachel raised her champagne glass and said, "To Claire, who deserves all the happiness in the world." And I felt genuinely celebrated in a way I'd never experienced at family gatherings, where Jessica's achievements were always center stage. I was opening gifts and laughing at something Amanda said when I noticed Tyler step away to check his phone. And when he came back a few minutes later, his expression had shifted from relaxed to concerned, and he caught my eye and gestured slightly toward the house. And I excused myself and followed him inside to Rachel's kitchen, where he said quietly, "Jessica knows about the shower, Claire. Someone posted photos on Instagram and tagged you. And she's been commenting on them asking why family wasn't invited, trying to make it look like you excluded her rather than the other way around. I felt a flash of anger but also a strange detachment, like her manipulations couldn't quite reach me anymore in this space surrounded by people who loved me. And I asked Tyler if there was something else, because his face suggested more than just Jessica's social media drama, and he nodded and said, "She's spiraling. The divorce is final next week and she lost a lot. Richard got the house because of the affair evidence and the financial deception, and her affair partner never left his wife like Jessica thought he would, so now she's alone in a small apartment with debt and no real savings." And I felt a complicated mix of vindication and something almost like pity, though not quite enough to regret my choices. And then Tyler added, "Dad's been funding her lawyer this whole time, Claire. He told you he wouldn't touch his retirement, but he lied. He's paid over $60,000 for her legal fees. And now his retirement savings are basically gone, and they're both broke and angry, and I think they're going to escalate things with you somehow. I just wanted you to be prepared." I stood in Rachel's kitchen feeling the weight of Tyler's warning settle over me like a cold blanket. The revelation that Dad had emptied his retirement savings for Jessica's legal fees after explicitly telling me he wouldn't touch that money. And the recognition that their financial desperation would make them more, rather than less aggressive in their attempts to get my wedding fund. And Tyler's expression told me he was genuinely worried about what they might do next, what boundaries they might cross now that they had nothing left to lose. I asked him directly what he thought they were planning, and he shook his head and said he wasn't sure exactly, but that Jessica had been asking him questions about my finances, whether I'd bought a house yet, what kind of car I drove, clearly trying to assess how much money I had and whether the wedding fund might still be accessible somehow, and Dad had made comments about how Mom's accounts should have been part of the estate, how Claire had somehow manipulated things to keep money that should have been distributed to all the children. A completely false narrative since Mom had set up the account years before her death with her own earnings and had every legal right to designate it for me specifically. I felt anger rising in my chest at the audacity of their revision of history, the way they were casting me as the villain in a story where I'd simply refused to fund Jessica's consequences. But beneath the anger was something harder and colder, a determination that whatever they tried next, I would not be moved, would not be manipulated, would not give them a single dollar of the money Mom had so carefully protected for me. Tyler squeezed my shoulder and said, "I just wanted you to know so you're not blindsided, Claire. They're desperate, and desperate people do stupid things, and I don't want them to ruin your wedding or your happiness, because that's what they'll go after next, the wedding itself. They'll try to disrupt it or make demands or create drama because they can't stand that you're happy without them." And his words felt prophetic in a way that made my stomach tighten, because I knew he was right. Knew that Jessica especially would see my wedding as an unbearable reminder of everything she'd lost and everything I'd gained by refusing to sacrifice myself for her. I thanked Tyler for the warning and hugged him, then composed my face into something calmer before returning to the shower, where Amanda immediately read my expression and mouthed, "Everything okay?" And I nodded and smiled, because I refused to let Jessica's shadow fall over this celebration, this afternoon of genuine love and friendship that she had no part in and no claim to. The party continued for another 2 hours, and I managed to be present for it, to laugh at the games and thank everyone for their generous gifts and feel grateful for these people who had shown up for me. But underneath the joy was a new vigilance, an awareness that the conflict with my family wasn't over and might be approaching some kind of climax. And when Marcus picked me up afterward and asked how it went, I told him about Tyler's warning and watched his jaw tighten with protective anger, and he said, "We should talk to a lawyer, Claire. Make sure they can't make any legal claims to the money or somehow disrupt the wedding. I want to make sure you're protected." And I realized he was right, that we'd been reactive rather than proactive, and that evening we sat down and made a list of steps to take. Consult with an attorney about the wedding fund and Mom's estate, increase security at our apartment building, warn the wedding venue that there might be family members who should not be admitted, document everything in case we needed restraining orders. And as we wrote it all down, I felt simultaneously sad that it had come to this, and grimly determined that I would not let them take this day from me. Would not let their desperation and anger poison the wedding that Mom had dreamed of and saved for, and protected with such fierce love. The consultation with the attorney happened the following Tuesday morning at a downtown office where Marcus and I sat across from Jennifer Marsh, a family law specialist who'd come highly recommended by one of Marcus's colleagues, and I methodically explained the situation while she took notes. My mother's wedding fund, held in an account solely in my name, established years before her death with her own earnings. My sister's demand for the money and my refusal. My father's ultimatum and subsequent estrangement. And Tyler's warning that they might attempt to disrupt the wedding or make some kind of legal claim to funds they believed should have been part of Mom's estate. Jennifer listened carefully and then asked to see documentation, so I showed her the bank statements proving the account had been opened 8 years ago, in my name only, Mom's letter explicitly stating the money was a gift to me, and the death certificate and estate documents showing that this account had never been part of the probate process because it was already legally mine through joint ownership with rights of survivorship that had transferred automatically when Mom passed. Jennifer reviewed everything and then looked up with an expression of relief mixed with professional certainty and said, "Claire, this money is unequivocally yours. Your mother set this up correctly, and there's no legal avenue for your sister or father to claim any portion of it. The account was never your mother's asset alone after she added you as joint owner, and her letter, while not legally necessary, provides additional evidence of her clear intent that this was a gift to you specifically." I felt tension I hadn't known I was carrying release from my shoulders, and Marcus squeezed my hand as Jennifer continued. "However, regarding the wedding, if you're genuinely concerned about disruption, there are steps we can take, including sending a formal cease and desist letter, making clear that any harassment or interference will result in legal action. And I'd also recommend coordinating with your venue's security and providing them with photos of your father and sister with explicit instructions that they're not to be admitted under any circumstances." She explained that we could pursue restraining orders if there were direct threats or harassment, but that the cease and desist might be sufficient to make them understand we were serious about legal consequences, and she asked if there had been any threatening communications we could document. I told her about the comments on social media and the message through the friend's account, but admitted that most of the pressure had been verbal or through phone calls before I'd blocked their numbers. And Jennifer nodded and said, "Start documenting everything from this point forward. Screenshot any social media interactions. Save any emails or messages. Keep a written record of any attempts at contact, including dates and times. Because if this escalates to the point where you need a restraining order, that documentation will be crucial." We spent another 30 minutes going through practical security measures for the wedding itself, and Jennifer offered to write a letter to the venue on legal letterhead explaining the situation and our concerns, which she said would make the venue take our security requests more seriously and potentially provide additional protection if my father or Jessica tried to claim they had a right to attend. When we left the office an hour later, I felt simultaneously more secure and more sad, because there was something profoundly wrong about needing an attorney to protect my wedding from my own family. About having to provide security photos of my father and sister like they were dangerous strangers rather than people who should have been celebrating this day with me. But Marcus wrapped his arm around my shoulders as we walked to the car and said, "You're protecting something beautiful, Claire. Protecting the day your mom dreamed of for you. And if they can't respect that, then they don't deserve to be part of it." And I knew he was right, even as grief and relief tangled together in my chest. The week before the wedding arrived with an intensity that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The final fittings and confirmations and last-minute details filling my days, while underneath everything ran a current of vigilance, because Tyler had texted twice more warning that Jessica was making concerning comments about not letting Claire get away with this, and Dad had apparently told a cousin that Claire will regret her choices. vague threats that Jennifer, our attorney, said weren't quite specific enough for legal action, but that made Marcus insist on hiring additional security for the venue beyond what they normally provided. I had sent the venue Jessica and Dad's photos along with Jennifer's letter weeks ago, and the event coordinator Christine had taken our concerns seriously and assured us that no one not on the guest list would be admitted to the property. But Marcus wanted someone specifically watching for them, someone trained to handle potential disruptions, and though part of me felt this was excessive, another part remembered Dad's face in my office lobby and Jessica's rage on Tyler's reports and knew that desperate people did desperate things. The wedding was Saturday, and by Wednesday morning, I was taking a half day to handle final preparations when my phone rang with an unknown number, and something made me answer it instead of letting it go to voicemail. And Jessica's voice came through tight and angry and slightly unhinged as she said, "Claire, we need to talk. You can't just cut your family out like this. You can't just pretend we don't exist and have your perfect wedding while Dad and I are struggling. It's not right, and you know it's not right." I felt my heart rate spike, but kept my voice calm as I said, "Jessica, I've asked you not to contact me. I have nothing to say to you." And she talked over me, her words coming faster. "You have Mom's money, money that should have been split between us, and you're spending it on some ridiculous party while your own father can't retire now? He spent everything trying to help me because that's what family does, and you just turned your back on all of us, on everything Mom would have wanted." The false narrative made anger surge through me hot and clarifying, and I said, "Mom wanted me to have that money, Jessica. She left me a letter specifically telling me not to give you any of it. She knew exactly who you are and what you'd do, and Dad chose to spend his retirement money on your affair consequences after telling me he wouldn't help you. So don't pretend I'm responsible for choices you both made." There was a pause, and then Jessica's voice came back different, lower and harder. "You're going to regret this, Claire. I promise you're going to regret treating your family this way." And she hung up before I could respond, and I stood in my kitchen shaking and immediately called Marcus at work to tell him about the call. And he said, "That's it. I'm calling Jennifer and the security company. That was a direct threat, and we're documenting everything, Claire. I'm not taking any chances with your safety or our wedding." I felt tears prick my eyes at the protective fury in his voice and the sad absurdity that my sister was now someone we needed protection from, but I also felt grateful that Marcus took this seriously and didn't try to minimize it or suggest I was overreacting the way my family always had about my concerns. And when Jennifer called back an hour later, after Marcus had forwarded her the recording he'd had me make of my description of Jessica's call, she said the threat was enough to justify a temporary restraining order if we wanted one, but that it might take a few days to get in place, and given the wedding was Saturday, our best protection was the security we'd already arranged, plus documentation of everything and a plan to call police immediately if either Jessica or Dad showed up anywhere near the venue or our home. Thursday evening, Marcus and I were having dinner with Tyler and Mia at our apartment when Tyler's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, and his face went pale in a way that made my stomach drop before he even said anything. And when I asked what was wrong, he looked up at me with an expression somewhere between fear and anger and said, "Jessica just sent me a long text. She's really losing it, Claire. She says she's not going to let you have your perfect day while her life is destroyed. She's blaming you for Dad being broke, claiming you manipulated Mom when she was dying to get more money, saying you've always been jealous of her, and this is your revenge." And he turned his phone so I could read the increasingly unhinged messages that kept coming through even as we watched, each one more accusatory and desperate than the last. Marcus immediately reached for his own phone and said he was calling our security contact while I read through Jessica's texts with a mixture of fear and sad recognition that she had fully rewritten history in her mind to make herself the victim of my malice rather than the architect of her own consequences. And Tyler kept saying, "I'm so sorry. I should have seen this coming. She's been getting worse since the divorce finalized, and Dad keeps enabling her victim narrative instead of making her face reality." And Mia, who'd been quiet through dinner, squeezed my hand and said, "This isn't your fault, Claire. You know that, right? None of this is your fault." Marcus finished his call and came back to the table with his jaw set in that way he got when he was protective and angry, and told us that the security company was going to have someone monitoring our building overnight and through the weekend just in case, and that they were increasing coverage at the venue starting tomorrow, even though the wedding wasn't until Saturday. And I felt simultaneously grateful for his thoroughness and devastated that my sister had become someone we needed protection from, someone whose threats we took seriously enough to hire guards. Tyler showed us more messages that had come through, including one where Jessica said, "Dad agrees with me. Claire stole from this family and she's going to pay for it," which made Marcus say firmly that we were documenting everything, and if there was any attempt to contact me directly or show up anywhere near our home or the venue, we were calling the police immediately and pressing charges. No hesitation, no family loyalty, excusing criminal behavior. I thought about Mom's letter, about how she'd known exactly what they would do and had tried to protect me, not just financially, but emotionally, by making clear that their actions were about who they were rather than anything I'd done wrong. And I felt a wave of grief for the mother who'd loved me enough to see the future clearly, and a wave of rage at the father and sister who were proving her right in the cruelest possible way. And I looked around the table at Tyler, who'd risked his own relationship with Dad to stand by me, at Mia, who barely knew me but offered unconditional support, at Marcus, who was calling security companies and lawyers and doing everything possible to protect the wedding Mom had dreamed of for me. And I realized that this was what family actually looked like: people who showed up and protected and celebrated rather than demanded and manipulated and threatened. Tyler's phone buzzed again, and he looked at it and said, "She's asking where you live now, claiming she just wants to talk in person to work things out." And Marcus said, "Absolutely not. She doesn't get your address. She doesn't get any information. And if she somehow shows up here, the security guard downstairs has her photo and instructions not to let her in the building." And I felt the weight of how completely my family of origin had fractured, and how necessary that fracture had been for my own survival and happiness. And when Tyler asked if I was okay, I said honestly that I was scared, but also certain that we'd made the right choices in protecting ourselves and our wedding, that Mom would approve of us drawing these boundaries, and that I refused to let Jessica's spiral pull me back into the dysfunction I'd finally escaped. Friday morning, I woke with a strange calm that felt almost dreamlike, considering the chaos that had surrounded the past 24 hours, and Marcus was already up making coffee when I came into the kitchen, and he looked at me with concern etched into the lines around his eyes and asked how I'd slept. And I told him honestly that I'd slept better than expected because something had shifted in me the night before. Some final acceptance that my family of origin had become people I needed protection from rather than people I could reason with or reconcile with. And while that reality was heartbreaking, it was also clarifying in a way that brought peace rather than turmoil. We sat together at the kitchen table going over the security plan one more time, Marcus with his notebook where he'd written down every detail and contact number, me with my phone checking that Jennifer the attorney had received all of Tyler's screenshots from Jessica's unhinged messages, and there was something surreal about planning a wedding celebration while simultaneously planning defense against family members who might try to disrupt it. But Marcus reached across the table and took my hand and said, "Tomorrow at this time you'll be my wife, Claire, and none of their chaos can touch that truth, can't change what we are to each other, or the life we're building." And I felt tears prick my eyes at the steadiness in his voice, and the absolute certainty that marrying him was the rightest thing I'd ever done, regardless of what my father or sister thought about it. My phone buzzed with a text from Susan, asking if there was anything she could do today to help with final preparations or just to provide moral support. And I felt a wave of gratitude for this woman who had been Mom's best friend and who had stepped into a mothering role in these final wedding days without me even having to ask, who had shared stories about Mom's love for me and provided tangible connection to the parent who had actually seen and valued me. And I texted back that we were okay, but that I'd love to have lunch with her if she was free, and she responded immediately that she'd pick me up at noon and take me somewhere we could talk away from wedding stress. Marcus had to go into his office for a few hours to handle some project deadline that couldn't wait, even though his boss had been understanding about the wedding week. And after he left, I sat in the quiet apartment and realized this was the last morning I'd wake up as Claire Patterson instead of Claire Chen, the last day of my old life before the new one officially began. And I thought about Mom and how she'd planned for this day years before I even met Marcus. How she'd saved and protected and written letters to ensure I could have this celebration even after she was gone. And I pulled out the memory box where I kept her original letter and reread it one more time. Her handwriting so familiar it made my chest ache. Her words so full of love and protection and clear-eyed understanding of exactly who Dad and Jessica were and what they would try to do. "You are worth so much more than they see," Mom had written, and I finally fully believed it, not because she'd said it, but because I'd lived the past 6 months proving it to myself, standing firm against their demands and manipulation and threats, building a life with people who actually valued me. And Mom had known I'd need that letter, not just for the money, but for the reminder that someone had seen my worth, even when I struggled to see it myself. And I carefully placed the letter back in the box, and closed the lid, and felt ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, because I was walking into my wedding day, not as the overlooked middle daughter desperately seeking family approval, but as a woman who knew her own value, and had chosen to surround herself with people who reflected that back to her. Susan picked me up at noon in her silver Honda, and we drove to a quiet bistro on the east side that she said Mom had loved. And as we settled into a corner booth away from the lunch crowd, she looked at me with such maternal concern that I felt tears prick my eyes before she even spoke, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand and said, "Your mother would be so proud of how you've handled all of this, Claire. Not just the money situation, but the boundaries you've set and the life you're building." And I told her about Jessica's threatening messages and the security we'd hired and how surreal it felt to need protection from my own sister at my wedding. And Susan nodded with sad understanding and said, "Your mom knew it might come to this. She talked about it in those final weeks, how Jessica and your father had created this dynamic where they felt entitled to everything you had, and she worried they'd come after you hard when she wasn't there to buffer it anymore." She pulled out her phone and showed me photos she'd saved, pictures of magazine clippings and notes Mom had made about wedding ideas for me. Pages torn from bridal magazines with flowers circled and venue styles highlighted, and handwritten notes in Mom's familiar script saying things like, "Claire would love this," and "perfect for my thoughtful girl." And I realized Mom had been planning my wedding in her mind for years, imagining this day long before I'd even met Marcus. And Susan said, "She started that wedding fund when you were 15. Did you know that? She opened that account the day after Jessica's 16th birthday party, when your dad spent $3,000 on it and forgot yours entirely 2 months later. And she told me that day that she was going to make sure you had something that was just yours, something they couldn't touch or diminish." We ordered lunch, but I could barely eat as Susan continued sharing memories, telling me how Mom would light up talking about my achievements even when the rest of the family dismissed them, how she'd kept every award and report card and college paper I'd written in a box in her closet that Dad probably didn't even know existed, and how in those final weeks she'd made Susan promise to be there for me when the family turned on me, because she knew with absolute certainty that they would. And Susan's voice cracked when she said, "She made me promise to make sure you knew you were loved and valued and worthy, to step in as a mother figure if you needed one. And Claire, I want you to know I consider that promise sacred. I will be there tomorrow, and I will be there for every important moment you'll let me be part of, because your mother was my best friend, and you are so much like her in all the best ways." I asked if she thought I should feel guilty for not trying harder to reconcile with Dad and Jessica, for not reaching out one more time before the wedding, and Susan looked at me with fierce intensity and said, "Absolutely not. Your mother spent her whole marriage trying to get your father to see you clearly, and he never did. He was so blinded by Jessica's demands and dramatics that he couldn't see the quiet, steady daughter who was actually successful and good. And your mom's one regret was that she didn't leave him years ago and take you kids somewhere you'd all be valued equally. She told me that in hospice. That her biggest failure was staying in a marriage where her husband played favorites with their children. We sat there for another hour while Susan told me stories about Mom I'd never heard, about how she'd been the strong one in her own family, how she'd put herself through nursing school while working full-time, how she'd always been drawn to people who were overlooked and underestimated because she'd been that person herself. And by the time Susan dropped me back at my apartment, I felt wrapped in the warmth of Mom's love in a way I hadn't since she died. And I felt absolutely certain that tomorrow's wedding was exactly what Mom had wanted for me, a celebration surrounded by people who truly saw my worth and chose to be there. And I walked into my apartment and found Marcus had come home early and filled our living room with peonies, and I fell into his arms and cried happy tears for the first time in months because I realized I wasn't walking into my wedding day grieving what I'd lost with Dad and Jessica, but celebrating what I'd gained in choosing myself and the people who actually loved me.